Welcome to the podcast of Reporting ASEAN, a space for talking about things that are truly Southeast Asian. This is Mara Cepeda, your guest host for this episode. Today, we sit down to talk about a news tool on reporting the climate, which has just been released and was written by the editor and founder of the Reporting ASEAN series, Johanna. I'm the Philippines correspondent for the Straits Times of Singapore and an editor with Fight Media in Manila, which has a lot of material by young storytellers around the climate. So today, I'll ask Johanna what's different with climate issues in Southeast Asia, why we need to take a second look at the language of news around the climate crisis, and how it bridges all news topics, just as it affects different aspects of our lives. Here's our conversation. Let's start with how this came together. The title struck me the most, actually, the first time I read it. What made you call it a doable tip sheet?
I didn't have the title at the start, but the more I thought about it, the adjective doable came to mind because having been in the news profession for actually 4 decades now, I realize, often we're tied in daily routines and all, and people feel they don't have time, right? Or they will say, we don't have the resources, or where do I get the knowledge or the information? So I wanted to stress that the book and I'm coming from a place where you all are too, meaning it's a very news-based tool. So it's not academic, it's very practical. So, and it doesn't always involve a lot of funds.
Why did you write this tool?
In 2024, we did a survey of quite a number of newsrooms in Southeast Asia. So these are all, meaning these are not newsrooms in the West. This is our neighborhood, right? We wanted to find out what is it like in your newsroom. Things like, where do you get your stories? Are they from press conference mostly, or reports, or on the ground reporting? What is your stuff like? How do you divide the work on climate? Stuff like that. So just to know first how we're doing it, and then the results were quite interesting. Newsrooms and editors said that everybody said the climate was important, of course, but if you look further at the responses, some things stood out. One of them being that they don't always have like a climate focused staff. They didn't always have news policies and guidelines that reporters can use in their stories. And they also chose, like from a list that I drew up, like what they thought was most doable. Again, that word. And one of them is like to train everybody in the newsroom to make them climate proficient. So that's where the idea of something that is newsroom based and also responsive to needs and realities of the media in Southeast Asia came out.
So this ebook that you have, you told me that the book didn't even have this format, the same format initially. What was that process like, writing and then for the book to evolve into what it is today?
At first, I thought, oh, maybe I should do something that, for example, discuss some terms that we encounter with regard to the climate and the weather and the environment. But then the more I thought about it, and I already had the draft list, it was getting longer and longer and longer and longer. And I said, no, this doesn't work. So in the end, I decided that may approach it in a different way. So I trashed that earlier idea and said, let me think about if I were sitting in the newsroom, how would I what questions might I have, right?
Yeah.
And so there are different functions in the newsroom. So I also went by function, because I think it's not just a job for reporters. It's also not just a job for the desks, right? It's not just bottom up, and it's also not only top down. So it's really for everybody. So I divided it into, like, first a general one, which I called starting points. So like, meaning if you put a journalistic lens to the climate, how would we think about this, right? Kind of. And then the next sections are divided into one for newsroom managers and editors, meaning these are people who probably like actually handle copy, give assignments, like vet stories, and can
Yeah.
issue policies. The
Mm.
other one is for the reporters and the ones producing the stories. And then there are special boxes around language and one about just explaining climate change in everyday words. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What I love about the ebook that you've made is that it's not only practical but actually instills values that are very digestible. But, you know, if you think about the warming of the world and all the issues that come with it can be quite overwhelming for a reporter, especially
Mm.
for those who may not have had a training, right, with science journalism. When you wrote this ebook, were you responding to a sense that climate reporting could be seen as too complex or too scary for some journalists?
Yes, and I'm coming from a place where I do write, but I also edit and I also commission stories. And so I can see it from
Mm.
different aspects. One challenge that I've seen is like sometimes people struggle with framing a story idea.
Yeah.
So that means something that is doable, that you
Mm.
can, has wide enough but not too wide, right? Specific enough but too not too much as well. So that kind of combination can be a challenge. Also
Mm.
because I think if you look at our news sites today,
Mm.
uh, there tends to be a compartmentalization of, like, for example, the global reports on climate are thrown to the global site, and people feel like this is the world, this is not me, or this is not us, right? And then you have local stories, which I think sometimes we don't make the connection to the climate, even as context. For example, if you report about a typhoon, for example, we should bring in the fact that today, right, that cyclones are affected by the climate context and by the warming earth because they lead to more powerful or intense typhoons that can then cause damage. Often, I think people, when you say, pitch me a climate story,
Mm.
they think of something like mega, humongous, but we don't
Mm.
need to cover the whole world, right? You
Mm.
need to find the local example that is connected to the global
Yeah.
context, which is why I say the climate is really the most global story ever. It is a
Mm.
global story
Glocal.
that manifests locally, right? And
Mm.
that therefore is for us in the countries and communities we live to cover. So we don't
Mm-hmm.
leave it to the foreign news, we don't leave it to the wire agencies,
Yeah.
we don't throw it
Yeah.
only to the environment reporter or a climate reporter if you have
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. No, you're right. But, one thing that I've noticed as well, because for the Straits Times, I'm a solo correspondent. Even in the
Yeah.
way that I would pitch stories, since I'm not a climate reporter per se, for certain newsrooms as well, climate is often treated as a sidebar or like a separate story rather than a
Mm.
central topic to your daily news coverage. Johanna, why do you think this is the case?
I think partly that's the challenge. But for the journalist point, from the journalist point of view, maybe it's also partly traditional, if you or want to say conventional news habit, because our work is usually divided into you focus on this, you focus on that, and sometimes it's topical, sometimes it's geographical, right? But this is a topic that for me really is a multi-bit story, and I think that
Mm.
I mean, as curious people, I think journalists wherever they sit, like for example, it's a business reporter or it's a labor rights reporter, they can do climate related stories too. And you don't need to see climate from the first paragraph to the end. You just
Mm.
need to find that hook. I would say you turn the switch on. You turn the
Mm.
switch on for everybody in the newsroom so that they can spot and say, I can do this. If it's labor, we can look at labor rights and employment policies, for example, in relation to working outdoors, right? In relation to benefits, right? In relation to maybe even the capacity of local health centers or medical professionals to tell what is if someone is suffering from heat related illness. There's acute and there's chronic too. So you
Yeah.
see that can be a portal, right, that leads you to
Ah.
quite, I think, interesting stories that can be your scoop.
That highlights even more, I think, the role of copy editors, news managers, especially in setting policy on integrating the climate across the newsroom's coverage. In your book, you had the term there called a climate proficient newsroom. Can you describe to us what's that and how it would
Yeah,
look like in the real world?
so a newsroom that is attuned and aware of the fact that the climate, it runs through everything in life. I mean, at this point, it's hard, a little bit hard, I think, to think of something that's not affected by the changing climate.
Mm,
Sometimes we don't know exactly the connections, but I think that's the job of journalists too, and which is
mm,
again to report beyond disasters. But
mm,
um, a climate proficient newsroom, it has that climate switch turned on, can recognize it, and has the confidence to explore these angles.
mm,
Whatever your topical assignment might be. It doesn't mean, like I said, that you talk only about the climate or only about a report or write about it only when there's a press con, right? But I think it's a good topic to go back to or to develop enterprise journalism. I wanted to give an example around the war in the
mm.
Middle East. Let's call it West Asia because Middle East is a colonial term. I think this war has climate written all over it.
Oh yes.
We think about what the Trump administration he called it a hoax, right? And then he was shutting down science and funding for a science institute, etc. Essentially, I think we're being told that what we are seeing and feeling is not real, which is a problematic, of course, right? But then it also drives this part about fossil fuel and oils as like the currency or a major currency of the world economy. But then you mix this with geopolitics and what we're seeing, and so it becomes much more than a war issue. Apart from the fact that all this bombing, even from the bombardment of Gaza, has been spewing so much more carbon into the air. So you imagine
Mm.
everything that
The
we've been
cost of war,
doing
the
all
environmental
the
costs of
time,
war.
all these years, it's like being set back by all of this. And that's only at the obvious visible level, right? We're not yet talking about things like Southeast Asia's been feeling the effects of the supply problems with oil and gas, among others. But there's also the time to ask, what are our policies like about diversifying, for example, energy sources? So China has invested a whole lot in green fuels, right? And in
Mm.
electrification. So maybe it seems they have more options, put it this way. And countries like Thailand, where I am, have more experience with using biofuels. I guess what I'm saying is that it's not only climate and it's not only war, but this conflict and these issues, they are not far from us. Even
Mm.
if geographically you might feel so, but
Yeah.
it is not, right? ASEAN has a target for renewables, for example,
Yes.
because
Mm-hmm.
everybody's panicking and saying that we get more crude oil. But there's another
Yes.
question there. It's just, what can this tell me, right? And what can this
Yeah.
teach me from an even wider perspective? Like it sounds like a whole question about the kind of development and growth that we say we want for the
Yes.
last maybe 8 years. I think it's also another round of questioning around what kind of development, what kind of life do we want,
Mm.
right? And what do we need to evolve in?
Yeah.
So I'm going to the
Yeah.
metaphysical, but I think it's all
No,
related. Yeah.
it's quite practical, really. I mean, coverage now of the Iran war here in the Philippines, for example.
Mm,
When I was speaking to some of the analysts, they said that the Iran war will really force ASEAN states to really take seriously their switch to renewable energy. And for countries like the
mm,
Philippines, and probably um, make our leaders really double down on just not relying on our all of these dangerous sources of energy that we've been spewing out into the world. What have you seen
yeah.
change in the way reporters, newsrooms cover the climate?
I'm not actually a climate journalist. I would say
Mm.
I'm more like an everything journalist, but I have been doing this for like uh, about 4 decades now, I
Yeah.
realize. But what I have noticed is that when I was reporting on like Southeast Asian issues, say in the 90s, I remember. So I was working for something that we used to call a development or an alternative news agency, wire agency. And the topic of climate change, we used to call it climate change yet. Not you didn't hear much of the phrase climate crisis or climate breakdown or
Mm.
climate collapse at the time. But because it was a more feature-ish like wire agency, like my colleagues would tease me and say, oh, it's climate crisis, it's only people like Johanna will go.
Oh
It's
no.
for her kind of
Really?
thing. Because it was, yeah, because it wasn't in that sense, it was kind of seen as like a topic for advocates, if you will, or not
Not really
not
ingrained
mainstream
yet.
news.
Ah,
But
there you go.
because it wasn't seen to be happening now.
Mm.
But then I always say to people that this is already now. It's very different
Yeah.
now. This is our climate present.
Mm.
It's not for the future.
Mm.
It's not in the future anymore. And if you
Mm.
think how many conference of parties have there been, that's how long this has been an official international conversation, right? I'm referring to the number of annual UN climate summits. So in the 90s, um, it was seen as kind of a soft topic, if, yeah,
Mm.
for lack of a better word, kind of, right? But I think since then, it's that means clearly in less than a generation, what was on the sidelines, right, became front and center because now we feel it. I mean,
Yeah,
even
but
today, I
mm,
was saying that I was outside, it was 41 degrees and the
ah,
heat index.
so
So but
humid.
it wasn't like this before.
Mm.
My point is also that it strikes me that what was once side news of interest to some people is now an everyday reality. But I think
Yes.
also over the decades, there's so much more data about the climate that we can use. And some
Mm.
of it I wanted to add is not necessarily produced locally, but
Mm.
we local journalists, we can use all of them. There's so much more data now. You can go to
Mm.
something like Climate Central and look at today's temperature, and it will tell you, same with your smartphone weather app, it will tell you how many degrees is it hotter than the average, say, or from a certain
Mm.
period, maybe 1970. So if you told your readers this, I think that gives them extra value, right?
Yeah. But for a journalist, for a newsroom that really wants to put climate front and center, how do you balance between the doom and gloom kind of stories versus providing
Yeah.
solutions, right? Is there a way to kind of balance those two things so that the coverage would be very complete?
I would say to be guided by first your curiosity and not equate disaster or bad news as good
Mm.
news. It's not the only story that counts. And like it's a common thing, I guess, in news or when provide information, we say that what might the audience like? It might be they
Mm.
want to know facts or knowledge, the context, or I would say the meaning of it, because we all know what happened, but we don't always understand why this happened or answer the question, what next, right? And then we want our audience to make a connection of some sort, right, to the topic that we're writing about. And then we want, hopefully, to be able to give them a bit of information or action. Because I think people don't want just to know and feel despair. No one escapes the impacts of the climate crisis, including us, right? Meaning, obviously, no world, no
Yeah.
news, and no people to tell the story. It drives home the point that we need also to be, but for lack of a better word, global citizens. So
Mm.
the why is in why we tell stories or why we tell audiences what's happening to our world, right? Needs to become infused with that larger purpose, which
Mm.
is not only to get hits or likes because you shock and depress people. That's an art, right? Storytelling, Mara, right? Is to combine
Yeah.
all of these things, right?
Yes.
And I mean, even as an average person, you want to know, oh, it's like this, so what can I do?
Mm.
Right? So that's why I also say, also report also on what works.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that that also gives your readers hope, right? That something is being done, that we're all not gonna die. That, you know, if good people apply the right knowledge, the right kind of funding, we will be able to, you know, combat a lot of these effects that are actually human induced still. Well, I have a very practical question that I think a lot
Mm.
of journalists would be interested in. Why does getting the language right or updated matter so much in climate reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually always been interested in language in news. So I've always liked style books and style guides. I'm not sure now how newsrooms do it, but in the agency, we used to have a style guide of sorts. So typically, we have things that tell reporters to make the writing and the editing easier, right? And more
Mm,
seamless. We use this word, not this word. We use British spelling, etc. Is the taste of your news product. And typically, it includes concepts like, for example, we don't say illegal workers. The more accurate and preferred term is undocumented workers, right? Because no person is illegal, we say, right? But like there are two examples in the book that I share, which is that, for example, the use of the terms natural disaster. So we
oh,
say that
yes.
disasters are
I,
not natural, they're
yes,
unnatural.
yes.
So we
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
shouldn't say that. We should just say disaster
mm,
and differentiate it from the weather event or the hazard. So not
yeah.
all the storms become disasters, right?
Mm,
So I would say in Japan, it might not cause the same storm, might not have the same effect, but in the
yeah.
Philippines, with poorer resilience and capability, it could be. So that's one. The other one is like this adjective natural can bring you a lot of trouble, which is you find it now in relation to the war on Iran, which is people say natural gas, natural gas, natural gas. But natural doesn't mean cleaner. Gas is a
Mm,
climate fossil, is a fossil fuel. So the words that are now used in documents, reports, and news is just gas or fossil gas,
because it could be misleading if you use natural.
which is actually accurate. Yes, because natural gas is used a lot by the natural gas industry to make it sound like they're the bridge
Ah,
fuel.
so
I just wanted to say because words are, how do I say, words are containers. They are
mm,
containers of ideas, emotions, and ID. And so when we write a story, I think that's an opportunity to use our space, use our access, if you will, or our role in information spaces to convey some of these important concepts. Yeah.
mhm. And I think that is really the value of this ebook that you've prepared, that you are going to equip a lot of journalists like myself to not commit the mistakes that, other people, other reporters have made. I mean, I was guilty of reporting about an earthquake and about a typhoon in the past and calling it a natural disaster. And there was a veteran reporter from a local TV station who was my friend, but
Ah,
who corrected me very nicely that, hey, this is you shouldn't call it this way, because, and then he explained it. And I guess even my editors at the time weren't aware that it was not the right term to use. And so
mm-mm.
hopefully journalists and newsrooms, now that you have your ebook and you've made it available online, they won't make the same mistakes, and hopefully there will be more responsible reporting about the climate moving forward. Well, now, Johanna, before we wrap, if a journalist, a newsroom editor, owner, is listening to this podcast, is there anything you'd like to leave them with?
I want to say that it's a very democratic topic.
Mm,
Whether you are a reporter or a copy editor, what I will want to say is that we all need to do the work. It doesn't come overnight. I think I want to say you need to read a lot. So and read and listen to stuff, even if it's not your assignment, because it's the only thing that this the only way you can imbibe it, so that it will allow you to sharpen your nose for news and say, that's a story, or no, that can't be right, right?
mm,
Or at a press conference, can be more of a skeptic and more confidently do it, right?
mm,
Instead of just be on the receiving end. I had an editor who used to tell us that we are journalists, so we know we are not stenographers.
mm,
So I like to say, when you know, what's the difference between anybody sitting there and listening and a journalist? Is that I can listen, yes, I can go through material that I heard or in a press con or in a report, but I have stock knowledge that I kept
mm,
in my own brain from reading outside, and then I chew and digest it, right? And then I come out with the story that makes sense in explaining it, hopefully, to my audience. So I would say
mm,
invest in yourself as a person, and then from the point of view of the newsroom managers is also to to invest in the capacity of your whole newsroom. One last thing I want to say is that I also learned a lot myself from assigning and copy editing. Like there's a recent book that I read, which is called Clearing the Air. So it's by this author, Hannah Ritchie, who is a data scientist, but actually she writes in everyday language. And it's no coincidence that her first chapter, more or less, begins with media presenting things as either black or white, or like this, a lot of these doomsday things. So she has a lot of facts that I do agree that sometimes media doesn't capture the nuance of, but we don't need to do we don't need to know everything, right? But I think we need to do this learning ourselves. And when you get in the hang of it, you know where to look for the answers for your readers, so we become the information arm. Yeah, especially on something that's so happening, like the climate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Johanna, where can they find the ebook? And I think there's a
Yeah.
newsletter
So
too, right?
yes. So we will share the link. So it's an ebook, so you can flip online, or it'll also be in installment in the Substack newsletter of Reporting ASEAN. So it's a newsletter with the same name.
Yeah. Well, again, Johanna, congratulations on the ebook. It's called Reporting the Climate, a doable tip sheet by Johanna Son, and we hope that it will be a very useful guide for everybody. Johanna, thank you so much for joining us this
Thank
afternoon.
you, Mara. Thank you.